University of Cambridge. I'm particularly interested in linguistic and cultural encounters in the early modern North Atlantic work. It's my great honor to be here to chair this panel, and there will be only two speakers here. After talking about textual sources, materials, and sources today, let's come back to the focus of the archives. There will be presentations by each of the presenters before the Q&A session. That's a very last phase. So our first speaker will be Dr. Rian Fong. Dr. Rian Fong is an associate professor of English at Kalamazoo College in the United States, as I think. He directs the Women, Gender and Sexuality program as well. His forthcoming book is concerned with Indigenous and Victorian literature, in which he also contributes to and co-edits special issues in this field. Okay, so let's welcome Rian.
Great. So good morning, everyone from the United States. So it's morning here. I was sorry to miss your morning sessions, but like yesterday, waking up for a session at 4:30 in the morning is a little early for me. So I just need to share my screen here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Let's see where that is. Let me try and do that again. There we go. Can everybody see that okay?
Yeah, that's good, Ryan.
Okay, great. And then I will go ahead and do that. So before I begin, I must acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, made up of the Anishinaabe nations of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. In Kalamazoo, where I live and work as a settler of Chinese and Dutch descent, I am specifically on Potawatomi land. And I also want to just echo my thanks to the organizers of this conference and just how everyone has been participating with such generosity and intellectual vigor over these 2 days. In September of 1871, one of the most famous photographs in Haudenosaunee history was taken of a group of chiefs from the Six Nations Reserve, which is located along the Grand River and sits just outside the current city of Brantford, Ontario. In the image, taken by early ethnologist Horatio Hale, 6 men sit gathered, mostly seated and surrounded by a set of objects laid out on a table. At the center, a man looks at the camera and another man stands to his right, inspecting Haudenosaunee wampum belts, which are traditionally made up of long strings of white and purple shells that are arranged into designs with deep historical and spiritual significance. Thus, while wampum has often been described and understood by settlers as a form of indigenous currency, wampum for the Haudenosaunee serves a much broader set of cultural functions as a central medium of communication and record keeping. And since the visual designs of a wampum belt encode this meaning in the patterning of their shells, their ability to operate as a material record is inextricably connected to the acts of interpretation that this photograph records. Read within the relational context of an oral tradition, a wampum belt only acquires meaning within a collective process that is activated by the wampum reader and held in common by the gathered community. As such, as scholars like Penelope Myrtle Kelsey, who is of Seneca descent, have articulated, the reading of a wampum belt both enacts and depends upon the principles of good relation that lie at the heart of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which, according to their origin stories, was founded on the principles of clear-mindedness and peace. It is important to note for my purposes today that the man standing at the center of the group is John Smoke Johnson, the grandfather of famed Canadian Mohawk poet E. Pauline Johnson. As a veteran and key military leader who fought for the British in the War of 1812, Smoke Johnson was given the honor of being a pine tree chief within the Six Nations Confederacy, a title that was bestowed upon individuals who made important achievements on behalf of the community. Additionally, the man sitting second from the left and looking on is George Henry Martin Johnson, Pauline's father, who is part of this group because of his position as a Royaner, or hereditary chief of the Mohawk Wolf Clan. In this way, the photo not only documents the centrality of wampum to the political and social life of the Six Nations Confederacy, but the prominent place and significance it had within Johnson's family culture. While E. Pauline Johnson herself was likely never trained to read the wampum, given the trajectory of her biography and the fact that as the daughter of an Englishwoman, she would not have had an official place within the Haudenosaunee matrilineal clan system, I will be arguing today that the aesthetic and communicative power of wampum was central to the ways that Johnson constructed herself as a Mohawk woman and poet, particularly in her use of Canada's colonial print culture. While many different wampum belts have been made throughout the centuries-long history of the Haudenosaunee people, the particular belt that provides a key insight into Johnson's engagement with print is the Kaswenta, or the two-row wampum, which marked the successful negotiation of a trading agreement between the Dutch and the Mohawk Nation in the early 17th century. Although specifically about trade, the Kaswenta also, as Mohawk's historian Susan Hill explains, established a set of principles that, quote, serve as the cornerstone for all subsequent Haudenosaunee European treaties and other government-to-government relationships, end quote. Consisting of two parallel purple rows set against a white field, the belt depicted an ever-flowing river in which the vessels of the two nations travel side by side. By never crossing paths, they would, quote, remain connected through the principles of peace, friendship, and mutual respect. As such, the Kaswenta articulated both the sovereignty and conditions of good relations between the two nations, principles which were re-articulated and affirmed with negotiations of the French and eventually the British that later came to settle in the homelands of the Mohawk and other nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. In each of these later negotiations, the Kaswenta was renewed in the new context and affirmed by both sides, and is considered, at least by the Six Nations, to be active and enforced today. For Johnson, the historical and political significance of the Kaswenta would have also translated into a personal significance. Indeed, as the daughter of a Mohawk Royaner and English mother, Johnson's life and career was defined by the convergence of cultural traditions that her parents' marriage created. As such, the two-row wampum offered her a framework that helped visualize and conceptualize the challenges presented by her identity and cultural affiliations. Furthermore, as an avid and skilled paddler herself, Johnson would have had a deep well of embodied knowledge to draw upon in understanding the narrative articulated by the Kaswenta, with canoeing in particular offering a point of grounded connection with long-standing Haudenosaunee lifeways, while at the same time offering a set of legible images that would have been understood by her non-native readers. Thus, in looking at the cluster of writings that featured paddling in 1892, the year in which Johnson was entering public life in a major way, their seemingly pastoral qualities take on a charged significance when placed within the Haudenosaunee context. And here, I just want to gesture that this is a part of a longer chapter in which I look at kind of clusters of writings that Johnson publishes in periodicals and print in Canada and in the United States at different points in her career. And I'm focusing here on 1892 because it was a really important year in her career. It was when she first gave her first performance and launched her recitation career, which would establish her celebrity, not only in Canada, but around the world. And it was also the year in which she published the essay, A Strong Race Opinion, in the Toronto Globe, which many consider to be the first piece of Indigenous criticism in Canada, and literary criticism in Canada, which talks about the representation particularly of Native women. And so all of this is happening in 1892 alongside the text that I'll be discussing today. And she was prolific throughout her career. So this is also taking place when she's publishing in a span of about 20 months, 20 different poems and 24 pieces of fiction or essays across a multitude of different periodical venues. So from within this body of work, the most famous of these paddling texts from this period is her poem, The Song My Paddle Sings, first published in the Toronto-based weekly magazine Saturday Night on February 27, 1892. Written to flesh out her recitation repertoire after her first solo performance, just 2 weeks after the striking success of her first public reading, the poem would eventually go on to become her most well-known and became beloved by a diverse array of Canadian readers. The poem begins with the speaker sitting on a ship with sails that remain idle and still. In the second stanza, the speaker realizes that the wind will not come, and so instead decides to stow the sail and to take up her paddle, whose soft song will fold in slumber the laggard wings of the indifferent west wind. Finally, finding movement, the next several stanzas, which I don't include here on the slide, depict the speaker paddling on, each punctuated by spondies that mimic the repeated strokes, drift, drift, and dip, dip, until the swirl, swirl, and dash, dash of an oncoming rapid add a thrill to the journey before the, quote, bubbles spray and fall in tinkling tunes away when the poem comes to its tranquil end. Throughout the poem, there is little to suggest the identity of the speaker or even any specific geographical or temporal location. While the context of Johnson's performance or byline would have suggested it, the poem itself appears to be a lyric expression of a day out in nature, with a little bit of excitement thrown in to add some drama to the short series of events that it recounts. For Mohawk scholar Rick Montour, however, the poem is one of Johnson's most thorough engagements with Haudenosaunee traditions and concepts, specifically with the images and ideas embedded in the two-row wampum. By beginning with a clear division between the sail and the paddle, the poem transforms the canoe, Montour argues, into a space of self-articulation, as the paddle becomes a, quote, instrument of agency that creates movement, which in turn provides a sense of personal identity and solitary progress in the world, end quote. Thus, Montour asserts, as a writer coming into her own when this poem first appeared in 1892, the song My Paddle Sings marks how she was keenly aware of her abilities and the freedom to combine the themes of nature and storytelling in her work, merging them as a means to affirm the survival of the Haudenosaunee through the metaphor that shapes the philosophy of the two-row wampum. And that's Montour's writing. While the tranquil optimism of the poem's ending is one that Montour finds problematic, in the way that it points to Johnson's grossly misplaced confidence in the Canadian government to peacefully reconcile with First Nations peoples, he nevertheless celebrates the poem's ability to enact a, quote, covert moment of personal revenge in the way that it employs the canoe as a cultural metaphor, without ever having Johnson perform her identity in an explicit way. In fact, for him, the poem's place as the most widely read work by a Native person in Canada speak to the ironies that are embedded in the word Canada itself, which is a Mohawk word, kanata, meaning village. Thus, the poem preserves a specific Indigenous cultural context in plain sight, even if its meaning skims just beneath the surface. Although Montour's analysis of A Song My Paddle Sings is an important intervention into the subtler pattern of reading it as a simple poem about nature, his framing of it as an exceptional outlier within Johnson's body of work overlooks its striking resonance with other works that she was publishing at the same time. Indeed, when it was placed next to some of the other pieces that appeared in Saturday Night in that pivotal year of 1892, the poem becomes a part of a larger pattern in which Johnson engages with the tropes and ideas of the Coswenta in a more sustained way. Most striking among these stories is the short story Sail and Paddle, which was published in August 20th, 1892, and which was similarly organized around the organizing tropes of the two-row wampum. In this story, the unnamed narrator sits aboard a canoe with another character, Sam, who insists on using the sail to get back to camp instead of paddling. After the narrator, perhaps unintentionally, insults Sam by asking if he knows how to sail, she sits back in silence as he becomes quite pouty and takes the vessel out onto the lake and into the wind. Silently, the narrator reflects that there is little that a man hates more than, quote, to have his knowledge of sailing questioned. As the rest of the plot unfolds, Sam successfully navigates the boat back to camp, but the narrative is mostly consumed by the narrator's commentary about the events, which juxtaposes thoughts on Sam's brazen confidence and boasting with the memory of her own paddling down a teeming rapids. Throughout, sail and paddle become metonyms for each of the two characters, with the narrator's paddling prowess taking clear prominence. Canoeing through the rapids, she comments, quote, was a good deal more exciting than the sail with Sam, even though the story ends with the narrator admitting that Sam had displayed, quote, some extremely pretty sail management, end quote, when the waters got a little rough. As with the speaker's confident maneuvering in the song My Paddle Sings, the experience and wisdom embedded in the practice of paddling, which connects her and the narrator of Sail and Paddle to long-standing Haudenosaunee lifeways and traditions, remains unacknowledged, but still powerfully present. Although much of this critical work in cultural encoding happens in these two works at the level of subtext, they take on increased significance when triangulated with an essay that also appeared in Saturday Night in 1892, A Glimpse at the Grand River Indians, which appeared in the February 20th issue that immediately preceded the issue where the song My Paddle Sings was first published. While she does not discuss paddling or canoeing in this piece, Johnson does explicitly address the history and customs of the local Indigenous communities with whom she was most closely affiliated, the Haudenosaunee people of the Six Nations Reserve on the Grand River. As such, when readers of Saturday Night would have encountered her lyrical depictions of canoeing in rapids in the song My Paddle Sings and Sail and Paddle, they would have been able to situate the speaker and narrator's perspectives with the specific landscape and worldview that Johnson articulated in this earlier essay, which would have endowed them with an additional political charge. These political stakes are made abundantly clear in the opening paragraphs of the essay, which recounts the history of the Six Nations Confederacy and how they came to be located on the Grand River. As loyalists to Britain during the American Revolution, the Six Nations were rewarded with lands that bordered the Grand River, which was meant to replace the Haudenosaunee homelands in what is now New York that were lost in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Formalized under the Haldimand Grant of 1784, this territory was then subject to continuous acts of encroachment by settlers and land grabs by the Canadian government over the next century. And there have continued to be conflicts even into our present day, leaving, as Johnson describes, quote, only a quote, little corner of land that the Six Nations can call their own. After an introduction that focuses on the yearly improving of the area's farming and the increase of the community's population, the essay then shifts specifically to focus on a ritual that she names the burning of the white dog, which involves an instance of animal sacrifice. Throughout, Johnson's tone is notable and striking. While her family had converted to Christianity in her grandfather's generation, the ceremony is nevertheless framed with a solemnity that resists any veering into the lurid or the voyeuristic. And although she describes the traditional practices as a, quote, childlike faith, Johnson never panders to a sense of scandal that her white readers would have likely felt in reading about the details of the ceremony. Instead, she acknowledges that it is a practice that is a central part of the Haudenosaunee belief system and calendar, and that their adherence to it marks a set of laudable characteristics. As she states, quote, there are few races that will not cling to their arts and politics as jealously as their religion. And this very tenacity is one of the distinguishable characteristics that cements individuals to a nation, end quote. Further elaborating that when a people are, quote, shorn of all that is best in their mental and moral condition, which she charges as the first step that settlers take when working to civilize what they are pleased to call the savage, they, quote, strip the tree of strip the tree of all its beauty of foliage, and then take the bare, unlovely trunk and transplant it into artificial soil, only to marvel that it thrives not. As such, while Johnson ends the essay with a problematic endorsement of the eventual goal of incorporating the Haudenosaunee people into, quote, high civilization, she emphatically states that it must not come at the expense of, quote, the beauties of the pagan faith, pagan honor, and pagan poetry. Strip the Indian nation of its heredity, its romance, its legendary lore, its faith, and indeed all its mental and sentimental acquirements, she states, and what is there left of man and manhood to work upon? This is an imploring and pointed question that repeats the image of the bare tree and grounds in its particular location and struggle over identity and land. In making these bold claims, the essay offers a striking contrast to the pastoral quietude that ends the song My Paddle Sings, especially. In so doing, it offers a critical framework for perceiving and understanding the poem's encoded Haudenosaunee features and their political stakes. Thus, by thinking about Johnson's most famous poem in its original periodical context, its juxtaposition with these other two pieces allow for a perception of a wider conversation that Johnson was developing across the various issues of the magazine, which occurred at a pivotal time in a career and as she was working out the particularities of her own self-presentation as a Mohawk performer and writer. As such, we can see in reading across these few pieces from this one slice of her career, how she is developing an understanding of her role within the politics of Indigenous representation that does more than merely replicate the terms of the Coswenta. Rather, the two-row wampum offers her a meaningful aesthetic framework that would come to undergird her poetic choices, both in content and in circulation across her career. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. It's quite fascinating, and I learned so much about the literature produced by Native American poets in the Victorian period. So next, let's welcome our next speaker. Hi, hello. Sorry, where's my notes? Okay. Okay, our next speaker is Sarah Galletly. Is my pronunciation correct? Sorry. Okay, so and Dr. Sarah Galletly is an ERC postdoctoral fellow at University College Dublin, working with the Southam Project, and she's also an adjunct research fellow at James Cook University. She's currently exploring the settler imaginary of the Indigenous in the periodical print cultures of 19th century Australia. She co-authored the Transported Imagination of Australia into Magazines and the Geographical Imaginaries of Colonial Modernity. Okay, so let's welcome Sarah.
Thank you very much. I'll just see if I can get my screen to work.
All good, Sarah.
Oh, good. And then
We can see the screen.
There we go. I'll just check it moves. Yes, great. So I'd like to start by continuing the thanks to Lara, Michael, and David for organizing this wonderful conference. And I'd also like to thank my Southam colleagues, Portia and Megan, for their insights and support at various stages of this research project. I've also included the URL for our project website here for anyone else who's interested in talking about all things Southern Hemisphere. We have a blog there and we try and update it when we can with new material. I should also probably acknowledge upfront that the very broad nature of this title doesn't necessarily represent the specific focus of this paper, but I'm sure we can all relate to that feeling of panic when just before the call for papers deadline, you have to come up with a title. So moving on. My paper today examines how the structural necessities of serialized periodical fiction reinforced representations of settler and Aboriginal mobilities for Australian settler readers across the 19th century. It combines recent work on Indigenous mobility studies with UPS's articulation of the periodical as an inherently mobile form, to explore how settler imaginations of mobility in popular cultural forms such as the serial helped inform judgments about Aboriginal peoples and their practices, and justified settler relations, both positive and negative, with Aboriginal communities on the colonial frontier. Rather than attempting to discern and catalogue the almost inexhaustible range of serial patterns at play in the colonial archive, my work foregrounds what Mark Turner refers to as the mechanisms of containment inherent in the form and narrative structure of the serial itself. More specifically, it suggests that through their representations of Aboriginal persistence and mobilities, certain serials resist the very modern concept of advancement, of moving forward, that periodicals and emerging narratives around colonial modernity itself rely upon. So, in a world of fiction, Kath Bode draws attention to a surprisingly large collection of serials featuring Aboriginal characters, arguing that in the 19th century Australian periodical fiction, quote, the unsettled colonial condition is evoked by depicting, not repressing, the Aboriginal presence. Although the majority of these characters do remain roughly drawn sketches or stereotypes, whose narrative purpose largely serves to assist and thereby to justify the colonial mission, Bode also identifies what she refers to as patterns of repression and emergence in these texts that hint at colonization's potential instability. To further explore these ideas, my current research considers the limits or gaps in the project of Australian settlement that these serial texts highlight. Apologies, I'm using a tablet because I couldn't get access a printer. Gaps that these in the project of Australian settlement that these serial texts highlight through their depictions of Aboriginal mobilities and persistence, through an exploration of how settler authors formulated ideological acceptable and supposedly suspect manifestations of Aboriginal mobility. It considers how the structure of the serial itself worked to reinforce perceptions of Aboriginal settler frontier violence and white supremacy, while also drawing attention to moments where representations of Aboriginal mobility and persistence appear to exceed the traditional bounds of the serial, disrupting its forward momentum and narratives of colonial progress and modernity. In its emphasis on settler representations of Aboriginal communities, this project inevitably relies upon Anglophone literary studies and imperial history, but it also endeavours to draw from approaches and concerns from the field of Indigenous studies in an effort to foreground Aboriginal presence and representations within these settler colonial texts. Taking up Alice de Panga Somerville's call in the volume that Chris Anderson actually mentioned last night at the roundtable to, quote, assume Indigenous presence and proximity rather than focus on distance and loss in our engagements with the settler archive, my work consciously acknowledges Aboriginal presences in fictional settler texts rather than contribute to their ongoing erasure from our literary history. Such an emphasis also highlights the way in which settler spaces were, as Alan Lester and Zoe Laidlaw outline, quote, co-created by uneven Indigenous and settler capacities rather than simply imposed, and allows us to foreground moments of settler discomfort and unsettlement that operate as counterpoints to the larger imperatives of this periodical fiction to support and justify the colonial project. This paper positions mobility studies as a valuable lens through which to re-examine texts that might, at first glance, appear to only perpetuate more generic, culturally non-specific stereotypes about Indigenous communities. It identifies incidents in specific serials where Aboriginal presence and their sheer persistence on the land offer, quote, potential challenges to the categories of belonging through which settler societies produce white privilege, as well as moments where the agency of Indigenous peoples to engage with or even shun pro-offered connections with settlers are foregrounded. So the serials I'll be discussing today all appear in Kath Bode and Carol Hetherington's To Be Continued, Australian newspaper fiction database of titles that have been digitised by the National Library of Australia in Trove. Bode draws from this archive herself when she makes her arguments in a world of fiction around the distinctive qualities of Australian serials and Aboriginal presence. So my preliminary findings are drawn from 9 serials appearing in weekly companions to the daily newspapers, such as the Sydney Mail and the Queenslander, and more regional publications, such as the Monara Mercury, the Warwick Argus Supplement, and the Goulburn Herald, all these serials appearing between 1860 and 1900. So, as Tony Ballantyne and Antoinette Burton outline, until fairly recently, imperial histories of mobility have predominantly depicted Europeans as global mobile subjects so that, quote, mobility becomes the property of colonizers and stasis the preternatural condition of the indigene. The local, in turn, is rendered as static and comes to represent the immobility of supposedly primitive cultures and civilizations. Nevertheless, as Rachel Stanfield outlines in the introduction to her recent edited collection on Indigenous mobilities, the mobility of Aboriginal populations has historically been used against Indigenous communities, both to deny their land rights and to justify coercive colonial policies to settle these same communities. Thus, in contrast to the idea of Indigenous peoples as intensely local, settler discourse more prominently depicted Aboriginal people as nomads with no attachment or claim to the land. Immobility and sedentarism can be just as freighted with representational meaning as mobility and take on a special significance in relation to Indigenous communities where rights to land were and still remain under constant attack. As Jane Carey and Jane Lyndon remind us, discussions of Indigenous networks and mobilities are rarely just a question of complicity versus resistance in the past, but one of legitimacy and the politics of authenticity in the present. By consciously tracing and acknowledging Aboriginal representation in these narratives, the inescapable reality of Aboriginal presence for many settler authors is foregrounded, even if they predominantly attempted to craft narratives that justified and supported their own occupation and settlement of the land. By their very nature, these texts cannot and should not be detached from their imperialist European perspective, yet foregrounding representations of Indigenous mobility and the periodical form within these serials can hopefully open up spaces to partially, as Topanga Somerville invites us in Once We're Pacific, quote, sideline that European gaze and produce spaces where its power is decentered. So, Linda Hughes and Michael Lund have drawn compelling parallels between the virtues that sustain a home and the traits required of serial readers: endurance, perseverance, and patience. PS has articulated how these values gain particular significance in British periodical novels of serial settlement, as she terms them, where colonial endeavours are depicted as requiring considerable investments of time, energy, and resources for settlers to feel truly at home. In contrast with the curious sense of stillness PS's novels of serial settlement offer, these colonial Australian serial texts rely heavily on the mobility of both settlers and Aboriginal communities. The seemingly excessive mobility of nomadic communities is frequently utilised to propel the narrative action of these serials, usually via plots revolving around attacks upon stations and the purposeful capture of white settlers. Robert Whitworth's The White Woman of Mandara from 1863 replicates many of the tropes traditionally associated with the lost child narratives of this era, and can be read as an articulation of Anglo-European apprehensions over, in Peter Pearce's words, having sought to settle in a place where they might never be. Following the murder of a settler's wife and the kidnap of their daughter by an Aboriginal tribe, a group of settler men in this serial set out to attempt her rescue. The serialized structure of Whitworth's story is reinforced to the reader through repeated cycles of pursuit, attempted infiltration of different campsites, and the resulting flight from Indigenous pursuers, ensuring that the action takes place over several chapters. Although these failed attempts might have frustrated reader expectations, they also create further suspense and anticipation for the final showdown between the adventurers and the child's captors. The serial's sense of discomfort is amplified through the repeated flipping of the power dynamics of tracker and tracked in the serial, so that the reader is left unsure who is pursuing and observing whom at several key points across the narrative. Similar strategies are also utilised in Charles Debus's Moroya, the Black Eagle of Colo from 1862, which is able to convey a sense of mobility and narrative momentum via its chapter titles alone here. As you'll see here, you go from trapped and the traitor to the rescue, the attack, on the trail, the ambush, the trail found, and even another chapter called the rescue. So you get repetition there within the titles themselves. So here you've got Aboriginal and settler mobilities both being seemingly overemphasized and taken to their excess to help propel the action and retain reader interest. Beyond the narrative impulses of the serial form itself, more explicit acknowledgement of the cultural and structural forces within colonial society producing Aboriginal vagrancy appear in several of these serial texts. The role of native troopers in inverted commas, dispersing expeditions is briefly explored in the bush naturalist's Red Dick, the Stockman from 1883, a cautionary tale of the dangers of alcohol and bush hotels on settlers' morality. Although the negative influence of alcohol upon Aboriginal communities is touched upon in many of these narratives, in Red Dick, the establishment of a bush hotel is also implicated in the disruption of the traditional mobilities of these same groups with, quote, contact with civilized Christians, teaching them nothing good. The evocatively titled Dead Finish Hotel is revealed to support a small group of Aboriginals who, quote, preferred the lazy, demoralizing life of attending on the public house to bush freedom and its consequent trouble of hunting for their daily food. Proximity to settler society is framed here as a corruptive force on the original inhabitants of these regions, drawing attention to the potentially damaging impact of settler contact on pre-existing Aboriginal dynamics of exchange and trade, and in the case of those attending upon the dead finish, sacrificing their bush freedoms for a more stationary and morally suspect existence. A major imperative of the Indigenous mobility studies endeavours to challenge the assumption that Indigenous people were merely engaged in travel for European purposes or along European lines. Such non-European non-European mobilities can be found in F.E. Lockwood's Genii of the Vanguard from 1899. In an installment where the serial's protagonist, Will Attenborough, finds himself stranded in the bush. In the chapter Lost in the Ranges, Attenborough is revived from a collapsed state after running out of food and water by a pitchery party on their annual pilgrimage to the pitcher grounds. Although he is encouraged to join the party, no deviations are made in the group's plans, and Attenborough travels with them for several weeks, all the way north to the Queensland border, before he is spotted by mounted police, who help return him to his station. Although these colonial serials inevitably stress the verticality of Indigenous relationships with settler communities, given their settler authorship, several texts still offer more horizontal modes of Indigenous connection, which appear to resist or temporarily decenter the settler gaze. In Flora, the Castaway White Woman from 1878, the constant motion of the Witbiligi tribe is predominantly motivated by seasonal hunting and foraging opportunities, though Flora, shipwrecked and adopted by the tribe, soon begins to suspect such movements are also designed to avoid any interactions with settlers. These movements not only extend the action and suspense of the serial's narrative across multiple issues by limiting its heroine's access to opportunities for escape or rescue, but it also allows the author to focus on providing its pseudo-ethnographic detail on Aboriginal societies to the reader. Flora also offers insights into the allegiances and disputes between different Aboriginal communities via this same narrator, outlining how two tribes band together to fight off another, whom they only attack after women from their tribe have been kidnapped. The two united tribes easily overpower their pursuers and proceed to spend several weeks living together in, quote, perfect harmony, ensuring that they could support one another in the face of further retaliation. Such narrative interludes beyond the bounds of settled territories briefly sideline settler imperatives by emphasizing moments of Aboriginal cooperation, with their initial joint attack justified through the inciting transgression of the kidnap of their women, very much mirroring the actions of the settlers in Whitworth's aforementioned lost child narrative. However, while these brief acknowledgements of non-European geographies and mobilities potentially disrupt settlers' expected perceptions of these communities, both Indigenous and settler characters remain similarly observed, ordered, and contained within the pseudo-ethnographic gaze of its narrator, and the serial's larger narrative drive forward towards its final resolution, Flora's eventual rescue. A particularly striking representation of Aboriginal persistence on the land appears in the form of the Batcherai tribe in Carl Thalberg's A Strange Exploring Trip from 1876. This first-person narrative details the adventures of a former sheepherder, Jack Leeson, who in the course of his extended trip finds himself adopted into a mountain community descended from Aboriginal tribe members and a group of escaped convicts who bartered their knowledge and skill set in exchange for a place to settle far from white settler society. The Batcherai lived in a fixed community with extensive agricultural operations, slab houses, and a fondness for the fine metals and jewels sourced from their mining operations. Initially compared favorably to real white swells, the Batcherai are still revealed to the reader to have been negatively impacted by the more capitalist and utilitarian impulses of settler society. Alongside its protectionist commentary on the need to shield Aboriginal cultures from the excesses of settler society, the serial could also be read as a cautionary tale on how attempts to, quote, civilize Aboriginal communities had the potential to severely corrupt their more innate priorities and mobilities. Notably, the serial dynamics of forward momentum, epitomized in the protagonist's own former wanderlust and desire for adventure, are stalled and actually reversed in this narrative, Jack ending the tale back where he began it, working as a sheepherder, realizing he had previously undervalued the affordances and pleasures of station life. So to bring things to a close, I'm still thinking through how this structure of the colonial serial worked to reinforce perceptions of settlement, Aboriginal settler, frontier violence, and white supremacy, and how this might be applied to the larger colonial archive. So I'd love to hear some thoughts about that in the questions. As Mark Turner reminds us, while the serial text, quote, always strives for and projects unity to a greater or lesser degree with its apparently unifying title, author, and structure, it is always liable to spin out of control, to start and stop, to diverge and splinter. By aligning the disruptive potential of these serial narratives and their representations of Aboriginal and settler mobilities, I argue we can explore moments where these texts appear to resist the rhetoric of forward momentum and advancement traditionally associated with colonialist endeavours. Although these serials are all written from a settler perspective, we can still draw attention to moments where Indigenous mobilities are presented in a manner that reinforce and acknowledge the existence of alternative Indigenous geographies and imperatives for travel. Through their depictions of Aboriginal presence and persistence within these texts, these serials can occasionally resist and undermine the very mechanisms of containment that seek to establish order via each new numbered serial part and date-stamped installment. And I've just included here a list of my bibliographic references for the serials for my fellow Trove nerds. Thank you very much.
Okay, I just unmute myself. Okay, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. Apart from abundant sources from historical newspapers, I indeed like your discussions about narrative and Indigenous persistence. I'm also quite interested in the debate of mobility and colonial modernity, as I think that the notion of modernity is partly shaped on the basis of early modern colonization in order to illustrate the interregional encounters. So it seems like we have plenty of time for questions and discussions. And actually, I have already received a few very interesting questions. The first one is from Professor Catherine Waters. So can I ask if you are willing to turn on your video and voice, or should I speak it out? Okay.
I think, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello all. Thank you, Ryan and Sarah, for two wonderful papers. So my question, Ryan, was actually whether you could tell us a little bit more about Johnson's recitations / performances. I was wondering whether these were reported in the press, and if so, how those accounts might compare with some of the settler accounts of the poetry that you started off with, that example of the poem and a settler account of that. It might be interesting to go across those two. And also, sort of a bit beyond that, of course, the most famous reader of his own work that you and I both know about is Charles Dickens. And he didn't, I mean, he started that, well, partly to make money, but to capitalize upon his celebrity. But you were suggesting that Johnson sort of, it sounded as if she began her recitations at the same time that she was making her name as a poet. And I found that interesting. So anyway, whatever you could tell us about the performance would be interesting.
Yeah, and it's great to see you, Kathy. And thank you for that question. I mean, I think there's a lot to say about this, primarily because I think in Johnson's reception, both in the moment and kind of in subsequent scholarship, the recitations have really dominated the ways in which she's been framed and understood, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that it was how she achieved her fame. So she had been writing and publishing poetry for a few years before she launched into giving these recitations in 1892. And it was reviewed kind of the very next day by the Toronto Globe and really celebrated. And it's kind of what launches her to become a touring artist. And so she would continue to write and be a prolific writer, but how she made her money was through these recitations. And the recitations and performances are very controversial because she's kind of very deliberately creating a particular kind of Indigenous aesthetic that is inauthentic, to use a very charged word. So there's elements of authenticity, but there's also elements of kind of invention She wears she would split her performances by halves, and in the first part, she would wear a buckskin dress that she and her sister made that would have various kind of accoutrements, some of which were from her Haudenosaunee Mohawk family, and some which were just have no relation to any kind of Haudenosaunee traditions at all. So she was very conscious about kind of what she needed to do to cultivate an audience of a kind of settler audience in order to make a living. And so she's been seen by various critics as being kind of a sellout in a number of ways because of these performances. And what I'm trying to do in this project is to kind of move away from seeing her performances as central to her career. I mean, I think it was central to her money making, but she publishes, you know, hundreds of texts across a multitude of different kinds of periodicals. And what I'm suggesting is that when we view those in juxtaposition and as a kind of a conversation, our account of Johnson changes, and her depth of kind of engagement with Mohawk and Haudenosaunee kind of thinking becomes clearer. And I think, you know, in an example that I talk about and I alluded to in my comments was that when she gives this her first performance where she's wearing this dress, and in the second half of the performance, actually, she will change into English dress. So it narrates a very kind of problematic narrative of assimilation. At the moment that she's doing that, the review comes out the next couple days, and then I think just a couple weeks later, she writes this essay that's all about critiquing in very vigorous terms how settler authors depict First Nations and Native women and so it's like putting those things next to each other, where it seems like some of the things she critiques, she actually kind of panders to in her performance. It creates a much more complex picture. And when we look at that across her work and kind of look at periodicals and circulation and different kinds of reading audiences and how she was really quite brilliant at kind of engaging them in different ways, a very different picture emerges. All that being said, Rick Montour, who I cited, is very clear that she was not, never gave a full-throated support of Indigenous sovereignty, and even for the Grand Nations, or the Six Nations of the Grand River. And so there's a lot of kind of problems in her moment and she's not kind of a radical in her moment advocating for Indigenous sovereignty, but I think in her aesthetic practices, some of those principles are being worked out.
She sounds a really interesting figure.
She really, really is, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so our next question is from Chloe. She has a question for Sarah. I wonder in what ways does the settler versus indigenous relationship with the land, as they travel over it, differ across periodical representations?
Well, this is, as you can imagine, a massive question because there's just so much in the colonial archive. Even within that sample of 9 serials that I kind of focused on for this paper, you get kind of a range of representations. I did actually have a longer version of this paper that I cut for time. But there's definitely in all of these texts this kind of underlying settler anxiety or feeling of guilt because of Aboriginal presence on the land, and they navigate that in different ways in different periodicals. For instance, some texts have friendships between specific settler characters and kind of more stereotypical noble savage warrior figures from particular tribes, kind of show the ways in which settlers are kind of, you know, learning from and engaging with kind of people, Aboriginal understandings of the land and of the terrain. And others very deliberately kind of stress the knowledge that the protagonists themselves, the settler protagonists, have gained of the land through their work, whether it be as a fencer or as a shepherd, the ways in which they themselves have kind of learnt the land through their own presence on it. And you also kind of have kind of characters who obviously learn from, are kind of shown to be particularly worthy of note because of the effort they have made to try and work in collaboration, in cooperation with local Aboriginal communities. So as I said, I'm afraid that is quite a massive question. If you had something more specific that you'd love me to get into, please let me know. But no, there's lots of kind of interesting things going on even within this very small sample I talked about today.
Okay.
Chloe, do you have anything to add? Do you have any specific, would you like to specify your question a bit more?
Sorry, I don't know why it was refusing to let me unmute there. I was interested because I see a lot in kind of representations of the Pacific, kind of Pacific Indigenous communities. There is a sense that, again, not necessarily a static or represented as entirely static, but there's this real sense across a lot of these texts by Western writers that Indigenous people have this fundamental connection to the land and knowledge of the land, and that the kind of the land is so much a part of their identity. And I wonder if with you know, Aboriginal Australians as being represented as being very mobile, I wonder if that kind of affected the way that they were represented as being kind of the not just the kind of inhabitants, but also the sort of the owners and the kind of the genealogical descendants of the land. And I just thought that might be a really, I mean, obviously a huge question, but just if there was a kind of particular tension there between the ways that they are associated with products of the land almost.
No, that's really useful, thank you. I think there's definitely, as I said, some of the texts take the most stereotypical kind of perception possible, but there have been a few. Genii of the Vanguard, for instance, that I talked about briefly today, goes to great lengths to kind of talk about the ways in which there are regional communities around the station that get set up. So they're kind of this fixed point, and various mobile communities kind of move seasonally, kind of both into the area and out again, and they kind of create relationships through that and learn about. They actually have a kind of a ceremony where they gain permission and advice on where would be good to settle from a particular elder. And so there's kind of an acknowledgement there of kind of, you know, Aboriginal stewardship and knowledge of the land for sure. So there are kind of these as efforts to kind of efforts at a more kind of nuanced understanding, but it's still always with that kind of underlying sense of, you know, but we've paid our dues and we've got our permission in inverted commas, so now we can settle and kind of, you know, you will now move around us whilst we are kind of this fixed point in a lot of ways. But yeah, thank you very much. I'll think more about your point moving forward.
Okay, thank you so much. And then Holly May has a question for Sarah. So could you please join the video discussion? Okay.
Yes, hello. Yeah, it's kind of a question mixed with a comment, I suppose. So I'm really interested in what you were talking about, kind of linking this idea of movement and mobility to the representations themselves, and how they're kind of almost kind of have a fluidity to them in a lot of senses. And I was just wondering actually if you've come across The Female American, a book Winkfield it's supposedly by, but no one actually knows who it's by because it was anonymous. It was supposedly written by the main character, and it's a really problematic but very interesting text, because it's like the author almost can't make up their mind about whose side they're on. Kind of at one point they're kind of idolizing the kind of Christianity of the colonizers, and the next minute they're idolizing and kind of romanticizing the indigenous cultures. But yeah, it's just got this kind of weird sense of constantly shifting and mobilizing their own opinion, as well as kind of this odd mobility of religion and beliefs, I suppose, within the text. And I was just wondering if that's something that you're thinking more of in your project.
Definitely, that's useful. Thank you. I will think more about that for sure. But yes, as you say, there's kind of this, even within, as you say, specific stories and serials, there's this kind of fluctuation, this mobility in their own thinking. There's certain sections where it seems to be kind of very much kind of supporting Aboriginal claims to land, and then others where it almost kind of needs to then kind of backtrack on that slightly to justify their own presence, their own kind of, so there's this very anxious thing going on, which Bode herself talks about, kind of the way in which kind of the unsettled condition itself is kind of, you know, created through presence as much as it is through more kind of Gothic Australian representations, which have been quite prominent in kind of scholarship, especially kind of in the kind of 1880s, 1890s. And so, as you say, I think it would be really interesting to kind of trace the actual like fluctuations within a specific serial or a couple, as you say, in terms of where perceptions in terms of both the perceptions of how fixed or mobile these particular understandings are, and also even the characters themselves. Like there are certain stories where characters start off very mobile and nomadic and end up very settled by the end, and vice versa. And that itself can be quite interesting to trace. It's a case of, you know, there's so much I could do with this archive, and I'm just kind of having to pick a few bits as I go on. I'm sure I'll be working on this for the foreseeable future. Thank you, Holly.
Okay, thank you so much. Next, Laura has a question for Ryan. And,
hiya, Ryan, and hi, Sarah. This was a wonderful panel. Please also do share all your references on Slack as well, because I'm struggling to write everything down. I had a question really, and it links to something that I see Doro's raised also in the questions about the extent to which Johnson's performance of indigeneity is full of kind of irony, pastiche, and what some critics have termed perhaps problematically self-exoticization. And I suppose this also connects with what you were saying earlier about the ambivalence towards claiming an Indigenous identity that she expresses, or she expresses herself, or did express herself rather. And I wondered whether then, therefore, the Indigenous studies frameworks, which were really compelling, are a bit too neat. Is there a problem with that, or does it matter? Does it not matter? Are you making an argument that's purely about aesthetics and is kind of independent of that?
So if, I guess, maybe you could, if I'm understanding correctly, could you say a little bit more about like what would be too neat?
I don't know. I mean, I suppose, does it occlude the areas of her identity and her writing that don't fit with ideas of Indigenous or Indigenous authorship or indigeneity?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that for what I'm trying to do here, I mean, and it's so slippery because I think her motivations are complex, right? And so I mean, I think that one of the pieces that I didn't mention in answering Kathy's question is that her father dies when she's fairly young, and so I mean there is like an element of survival in this, where she needs to kind of make a life and figure out how to survive. And so I mean, I think that there are ways that she is, I don't know that, I mean, it's with irony, parody, and pastiche. I mean, with some of these, it's hard to read the different registers, because I think that she's very conscious about invoking sentimentality. She doesn't reject the name that kind of circulates around her, and cultivating this image of a Mohawk poetess. And I think from a standpoint of you know, more contemporary Indigenous studies frameworks, you know, what she's doing is deeply problematic and feeds into a lot of these things. And I think I take inspiration from people like Penelope Myrtle Kelsey, who's going back to the 19th century and kind of thinking about, like, you need to think about these the way that people like George Eastman and some of these different performers that were like, what they're doing is complicated. And so I think that the complexity for me is to try and kind of to follow kind of indigenous frameworks, specifically within a Haudenosaunee context, and then to think about what that sheds light on in terms of Johnson. Because I think part of a lot of the scholarship about her is trying to pin down, what is she really, right? And I think that, is she really authentic? And this is even from within Six Nations communities. There's people who are like, well, she's not actually one of us for very particular reasons. Her mother's English. She's not part of the matrilineal system, period, the end. And I respect that tremendously. But I think aesthetically, she's doing something that's more complex. And so, and I take, whether the Canadian readers got it, I don't think that they did. I don't think that there's evidence that they did. And there's a book called Seeing Red, and I can't remember the authors, where they talk about how she was obituarized in her obituaries and memorialized. And it's like, it's clear they didn't get it. Is that part of what Johnson's intention was? I'm not sure. What is clear to me, though, is if we look at 20th century Haudenosaunee and Mohawk writers like Beth Brandt and Patricia Montour, and even critics like Nishuana Goman, they recognize her complexity, and they see her as a kind of foremother and position her in that regard. And that to me is significant. And so part of what I'm trying to do is balance all of those things, and think about that. And also just try to like bracket the question of authenticity and think about how she was engaging with Haudenosaunee ideas. How is she doing that is a more of a question for me, rather than like, is this like too neat or not? Is this ironic? Is it genuine? Is it authentic? Is it inauthentic? I mean, I think those are important questions, but I'm also just trying to firmly situate her in this different context. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks. That's really, really helpful, because I was just wondering, because, I mean, your paper and Johnson generally kind of makes me think of other forms of self-exoticization that Indigenous people participated in, like ethnographic displays and things like that. And
yes,
it's very tricky to find a way of talking about this stuff, isn't it? And I think you're right. I think we do need to move away from ideas about authenticity. But yeah, it's like you say, balancing all those contradictions and balancing the different ways in which they've been remembered historically by settlers and by other Indigenous writers, as well as part of that critical heritage as well, is really important.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think for me, it's also like, what did Mohawkness or Haudenosaunee-ness, or what she would call Iroquois-ness, like what did that mean for her in her terms, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so and how that lines up with other folks' ideas, it's in tension with both settler ideas and also with other Mohawk and Haudenosaunee folks at both within the 19th century and after. So it is tension there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Doran, did you have a comment on this discussion?
So I struggled hearing. I'm not sure how the audio was. Just to Matt or Ryan under now, because I also asked about library, etc. Do you hear me?
Your sound is really garbled, so I'm not catching what you said. I'm sorry.
Yeah, indeed. Yes, okay. Is there now? Do you hear me there?
Maybe if you turn off your video, it might make the sound a little bit clearer. Maybe, just in case.
No.
No.
Okay, so I'm asking. Thank you.
I think we might have to wait and see with Dora, or perhaps she can pop her ideas in the chat.
Yeah, so we're waiting for her question.
I had one in the...
Now, can you hear me? No. Okay. I'll just post it in chat if it were posted.
And Michael, can I ask you if you're willing to ask your questions now, or
yeah, sure thing. In a funny irony of the system, I'm not actually able to make my face appear among the ones on screen. So my question, it was really for both panelists, but it was put into my head by one of the images you showed, Sarah, which was of the story, I think it was called Moruya, or the Eagle Chief. And that just, I then got onto the resources I have at my fingertips right now, and I was wondering where this word Moruya came from. So if he's from the Colo, then theoretically he should be speaking Daruk, in which case the word for eagle is Burumurring, and Murring could almost be Moruya. And if he's from the other languages spoken nearby, it was the Hunter Valley language, and in that language, those languages, the word for an eagle, and it's also in Wiradjuri, is Milian, which could almost also be Moruya, almost. So that just got me wondering about the use of Indigenous language in these early settler texts, and your impressions of what sort of practices these early writers were using. You know, in my own work, which has mostly just been on a few poets, you know, there seems to be a much more varied and inventive sort of practice among the settlers in the first half of the 19th century. And by the end, you get these nationalist balladeers and so on who kind of have a bit of a stable vocabulary that they've just appropriated, and they have no idea which Indigenous language these words came from anymore. So I was just wondering about your impression of the use of Indigenous language in these settler texts. And by contrast, Ryan, I was wondering if you could comment on the way your poet's name just slipped from my head, the way she deploys, again, Indigenous words in her poetry. You know, whether she does she just use her own tongue, her own mother tongue, or does she strategically make use of famous Indigenous words that the settlers might know in order to create an sort of Aboriginality in her poetry?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll just very quickly say thank you so much for that comment, Michael. All that information about kind of particular terms is really valuable, and I'll have to follow up on it myself more, for sure. I think, as you say, there's this definite kind of balance between texts which seem to try and kind of couch their representations in this more, as we keep saying, kind of authentic perception of the culture, kind of amount of knowledge through use of certain terms or particular phrases, or even real tribes that were kind of living in the regions at the time, whilst others just create their own completely mystical kind of made up tribes and locations. What I find particularly interesting, what you were saying about this kind of distinction between the earlier and the later period, which I'll definitely have to check up on more. Is there perhaps kind of, as you say, more of a deliberate attempt to actually kind of do the work in the earlier text versus this kind of use of these tropes, or whether I think a lot just depends on the author as well, because obviously some of these texts were written by people who were actually living in the colonies, and others were written by people overseas and just got published in these Australian newspapers, and that as well plays a big part in terms of both kind of, you know, the representation of Aboriginal people and the extent to which they do or don't get kind of, you know, subsumed into the same tropes that were put upon kind of North American Indigenous peoples at the same time. So I might have to follow up with you a bit more about those kind of terms offline, but thank you very much for your question. It's really useful.
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of Johnson, it's, I mean, her family is kind of a kind of classic example of language loss over generations. So while her grandfather, who I showed in the picture, was somebody who was deeply steeped in Haudenosaunee oral traditions and was bilingual and kind of known for, he was actually nicknamed the Warbler because he was supposed to be such a beautiful speaker. That bilingualism kind of gets lost over the generations. And it was part of the Johnsons' own kind of investment in establishing a certain kind of power and economic and social power in the emerging colonial society of Canada at the time. So Johnson and her siblings don't learn Kanien'kehá:ka or Mohawk. She's very interested though in language, and so when I've been in her archives, there's like lots of scraps of words that she's looking for. From what I haven't read every single one of her poems because they're it's copious. She's not as much interested in kind of language use in the poems themselves, and kind of using particular terms. But I think what Montour is signaling when in his reading, when he talks about Canada actually being a Mohawk word, Kanata, he's signaling that kind of doubleness. Like even if everybody doesn't think it's an indigenous word, it is. And so those are the ironies that he's interested in as a critic. But for her, it's more of a kind of side project than one that's like that she's interested in kind of learning more of these terms. And she has like lists of words that are kind of drawn out on scrap pieces of paper in the files of the archive. But they don't become a kind of sustained interest in incorporation in her poems itself, at least from what I've read. But she is kind of incorporating a number of these different ideas throughout, and other elements of Mohawk and Haudenosaunee culture, and kind of making that kind of clear. So,
thank you.
Okay, so let's come back to the question from Dr. Doro Wieser. She's wondering in terms of gender, what the performance means. This is an age of what exhibitions in Chicago and the Buffalo Bill show?
Yeah, so I mean, just perhaps a too simple answer is that, I mean, these performances were highly gendered. So I mean, she is absolutely cultivating a particular and highly feminized kind of image of indigeneity, and then also kind of an ability to step into and perform a particular mode of English femininity as well. So I talked about her performances. So she would wear one particular dress, the buckskin dress, and then she would come out in a gown in the second half. And so this is all very much part of her performance aesthetics. Is that she has it's a highly gendered and highly feminized mode, and the reception that in the reviews of her performances basically just eat that up with a spoon. So I mean, she's charming, she's beautiful, she's her elocution is wonderful. So even the ways that she's being perceived are very much part of that. And so so she's cultivating this image of the poetess, and as the Mohawk poetess, as she would come to be known, and which lots of people have written about. Tricia Luton's especially writes about this compellingly in terms of race. But that's definitely the tradition that she's thinking about and cultivating in terms of her performance.
Okay, thank you so much, and Ray and Sarah, for your talks, and also thank you, Laura and Marco, for your organization. So.